welcome to Phoenix Books in beautiful Burlington, Vermont. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Todd. I'm the manager here at our Phoenix Books Burlington location. Tonight we're here to celebrate Out, Out, a novel of women and apes with the author Kim MacQueen. Kim is relatively new to Burlington. Actually, Kim's first week in Burlington was the same week that Phoenix here in Burlington had their grand opening. So in some sense, we are twins. At least in Burlington, we're twins.
We're twins.
Kim also joined our club here, our book club, which is great. She wanted me to remind all of you that we have a book club and encourage you to join. It's a way to save some money when you shop with us and to support us, which is fabulous. Kim was moving up from Tallahassee, and I hope is that she's finding Burlington to her liking. This is a self-published book, and Phoenix Books, one of our key principles is community and support of local people. So we've devised a local authors program for authors like Kim who don't have their book published by a big publisher. They did it themselves, which is a lot of work, and we're here to help support them. We'll put them on our bookshelves, and then we provide a venue for authors like Kim to come and talk to you about her book and give you a chance to listen and learn about what it's like to publish a book yourself and about this really fine book. So please welcome Kim MacQueen.
This is my first book. I'm working on the second one right now. It is self-published. And one of the fantastic things about being here in Burlington is that helping other writers on their journey to publication has become my job. I work at Champlain College and teach writing there, and also work as managing editor of the Champlain College Publishing Initiative. And we work with an ever-growing number of self-published authors on anything from manuscript development to design to sort of walking them through the steps of publication to launch and to marketing and everything that goes along with that. I'd like to talk to you about that at the end of this reading if anybody is interested. And it was also a very big part of its getting to publication. So let me talk a little bit about the book itself at this point. It is an actual novel that came out of personal experience. By that I mean I had a job at an ape lab in Atlanta. I was the business manager. And it was one of those jobs that is just so crazy that everybody is taking notes all the time. Because just weird stuff happens. And it was also a place, coincidentally, that most of the people carried guns. Because when big, 400-pound apes get out, which happens occasionally, you need to have not shotguns, but ketamine guns. I never saw them used, but they were always sort of at the ready, and there was in the lore of the lab a couple of times when they had to be deployed. So I was business manager there for about 3 or 4 years, and I really got sort of captivated by not only the science, but also the science soap opera, the weirdness that grew up around this lab. And I wanted to write a book about it, and I flirted for a while with the idea of a nonfiction book until I realized that what I really wanted to write about was the crazy, And so when Neil Charnoff interviewed me last week for VPR, which was great, he asked me this. I mean, I was expecting him to ask me like detailed questions, right? And then he lobbed like this big kahuna. He said, "Why did you do this book as fiction?" When I'm walking my dog and I'm pretending to talk to Terry Gross, which I do all the time, I answered that question so brilliantly. But when Neil Charnoff asked me, I was like, I don't know. And it sort of forced me to come up with the rationale for why I did it that way. That's 25 words or less. And what it boils down to is capturing the crazy. And really, fiction was the absolute best way to do that. So when you read this, know that it is narrated by a woman named Deb. That Deb has my job, the same job I had, but doesn't look like me, doesn't act like me. She's a little nuts. She's kind of not, I'm told she's not 1,000% likable because I wanted to make her very realistic, and I think she turns out a little obsessive. And I did not fall in love with my boss, as Deb does in this story. And the husband, I tell my husband, Steve's over there, and I'm always having to tell him that he is not the husband in the book, who bears no relation to Steve. So I sort of wanted to set this up for you. And what I'm going to read tonight is kind of an introduction to these apes. I ended up working for a pretty famous set of primatologists who you may have heard of in the news since. This woman is named Sue Savage Rumbaugh. Not terribly well known in 2000 when I worked at this lab, but she was named one of Time's most influential people in 2011. And was the apes and her lab were featured on Oprah, and in 2011 she also gave a TED Talk, which you can find online or on my website. I'll put it up there. So that's 2011. In the fall of 2012, so just a couple of months ago, Sue Savage Rumbaugh was removed from her post because a group of, I think they're called the Bonobo 12, wrote a letter to the board of the Great Ape Sanctuary, Great Ape Project Sanctuary in Iowa, where she worked, charging that she was mentally unfit to run the lab. One of the star apes, Pan-Benicia, I worked with the people who worked with Pan-Benicia and got to know her pretty well. She actually passed away in November of pneumonia. So I wanted to point all that out to you because these are apes, these are personalities that you can follow in the news, and they're pretty fascinating people and apes. Enough that I really wanted to write a novel about them. So now I'm going to read to you for a little while, and I want to do this. I want to do this interactively because I'm not positive how long to read. Right? So I might just look up at some point and go, is it too much? You want some more? Or all right? So you want to try it that way? I cannot stand the idea that you might get bored. Right? So work with me. Okay? What's that? Yeah. Yeah. As long as you can do it nicely, a little bit more setup. So in this scene, Deb, the narrator, she's describing starting her first days at the lab. And they sit her down and they have her watch a tape of the apes when they were a little bit younger that describes the research, it describes the researchers, and it sets up a couple of scenes introducing these apes. So you're going to hear about Faraji, who is the lead ape in this story. You're going to hear about Malika, his mother, and of course Soraya Baldwin Rule. You've already seen her on all the cool posters that Phoenix did for this event. She is the fictional lead primatologist for this lab. So this is just meant to show you what this place is like and the kinds of things these apes can do. And then after I get done reading, I would love to take questions, and let's have a discussion, and it'll be great. Okay. My first mornings on the job started hot and sticky, 90 degrees before 9 a.m. I hurried each day from the temperature-controlled air of my car to the lab's front door, huddled under the canopy of the leaves above, already tired before I ever got started. Then I opened the heavy glass door and stepped into a cloud of cool, dry air and the calming hum of the industrial-sized air conditioner. On one of those first mornings, Christine had left a videotape on my chair with "Watch Me" scrawled on a yellow sticky note. The tape was old, light like dry bones, with a faded, peeling label, its gluey backing all dried up. It looked like it might get caught in the workings of the VCR. I found an old-school-style TV cart in the conference room, and I pulled up a chair next to it. The tape held a homemade documentary of Soraya's work with Faraji. As it got going, I realized its setting was the same view I'd get if I stood up on a chair and looked past the TV through the Lexan window looking into the ape area, a big, gray, square, concrete block room built to house a family of bonobos. The researchers still call it the living room. The tape begins with a scene of the two of them sitting there together. She sits cross-legged in jeans and a red ribbed t-shirt, cut to fit her body but comfortable. The date stamp on the video is June 5th, 1981. She's in her early 20s, thin, flexible. She sits cross-legged on the floor, sneakered feet tucked under her knees. Her name flashes in red underneath her on the screen. Soraya Baldwin Rule, professor of biology. Her hair is the color of chocolate bars, curling over her shoulders and creeping down her back. Faraji is knee to knee with her. The camera comes in for a close-up on his face, shiny black with brown eyes. I thought again how like a chimpanzee's his face was, but how different, smaller, the features sharper. Bonobos look more human than chimpanzees do, Christine had told me. They're really closer genetically to us than they are to chimpanzees. I stared at Faraji on the TV screen now. Text running under his face read, Faraji, bonobo, pan paniscus. The camera pans to include them both. Her dark brown eyes focus only on him. They make conversation for a moment. Faraji, can you show me the ball? She asks him. Faraji stares at her, hesitating for just a second. Of course he can show her the ball. It's as though he's waiting for her to give him something more difficult to do. If he had eyebrows, you could almost picture him raising them at her like an insolent teenager, and it's only when he doesn't that he begins to seem not human. His all-black face is impassive as he scoops up the ball with a hairy arm as wide at the bicep as a man's head. He sits it down in front of her. Good. She sounds like she's talking with a 4-year-old human boy. Now, can you show me the doggy? There's a 6-inch-long stuffed dog behind Faraji, possibly a plaything for the younger apes. He can't see it. He looks around a minute, peers over his left shoulder, spots it, and then palms it and holds it up to her. Good, she's beaming at him. Now, can you show me the snake? Same thing. This time, the item she desires is across the room, black and yellow rubber lying against the gray concrete wall. He lazily crosses the room, only now really starting to move like an actual ape you might see at the zoo. Swinging arms as long as his legs, covered with soft, shiny black hair, maneuvering on knuckles curled into easy fists. He picks up the snake, brings it to her. Great, Faraji, thank you. Now, can you make the doggy bite the snake? Faraji sits back down, gets comfortable, takes the plastic snake and puts it in the dog's mouth, sets them both down on the floor in front of him and looks at her. The voiceover starts then, an older man's voice, placing the two at the Southern University Primate Language Lab. At the time the tape was made, Faraji was about 6 years old, a male bonobo ape able to demonstrate understanding of at least 300 symbols as well as novel commands, like make the doggy bite the snake, on her request. He'd do it for other researchers too if he knew them well. But it always seems to work better for Dr. Baldwin Rule, the voiceover said. The footage cuts to a talking head-style interview of Soraya standing in the woods outside the lab, her head and shoulders taking up the screen as she squints a little in the sun and talks to the camera in a voice that's crisp and soft, girlish. We never set out to teach Faraji to communicate with us in English. It happened organically, more or less by accident. We were trying to teach his mother, Malika, to use the symbols on the computer keyboard that was developed here at the lab. The idea was to teach the apes to use the language symbol keyboard to communicate with us, to ask for things like food or permission to go outside. Ferrogy was always there, usually playing in a back corner of the room. We didn't even think he was paying attention. Her voiceover continues. Then one day, when Ferrogy was about 3 years old, we took Malika out of the room because she had to go see the vet. Ferrogy just went over to the computer keyboard and started pressing the buttons to ask for foods he liked, just as though he'd been doing it always. Keep going? Keep going? Oh, cool. All right, great. I'd do this all night. Christine had told me that week that after 5 years of trying to teach Malika to use the lexicograms to ask for food or to go outside, all the skills Ferrogy had picked up as a toddler ape on the fly, they'd given up, blaming her lack of attention. She didn't seem to want to learn, and she didn't seem to be able to. They tracked her eye movements with the video camera, Christine said, and they realized that she was scanning the place every second, running her eyes up and down the walls and over the doors every minute of every day, like she never really trusted that she was safe, like she never trusted that her children were safe. She still does that. She can't ever relax. We try to make sure the little ones are with her constantly because otherwise she starts acting nuts, charging the chain link and screaming. The video showed a still shot of young Ferrogy, more shiny hair tufted on his boyish ape face, on a jaunt in the woods. He's walking upright, bow-legged, on a leash. Soraya's looking off camera, pointing out something in the woods. The photo's from back before the development of his bodybuilder arms, and he gazes back over his shoulder into the camera. The shape of his body is like a walking frog, with knees and elbows bent out to the sides, turned out like a dancer. Older footage followed, grainy footage of a babyish Ferrogy at a computer keyboard. He wears huge headphones covering the sides of his head while a researcher calls to him from inside a gray box, the size of a telephone booth, in the corner of the room. Ferrogy, can you point to the symbol for orange? Point to the symbol for orange, comes the researcher's voice. You can see Ferrogy point his tiny right index finger at something on the computer, and then the computerized voice says, orange, over the loudspeaker. Good, Ferrogy. Now can you point to the symbol for outside? Point to the symbol for outside. Outside, says the computer's voice. Great job, Ferrogy. The researcher can be heard clapping his hands from inside the box. Ferrogy gives himself a hand, too. Then the narrator is silent as another outdoor scene unfolds. Ferrogy sitting cross-legged on a path through the woods behind the main building. He's flint-knapping, fashioning tools from stone like the ancient Indians did. The sun shines on his black fur, and his big bodybuilder arms click, click, click the two rocks together to make a spearhead. Its audience now updated on his early history. The video returns to Soraya and an older Ferrogy at the time of the taping, still sitting cross-legged together on the floor. A voiceover guy explains that a few of Baldwin Rule's critics have charged that Ferrogy is just watching Soraya's face for clues, rather than really knowing the words. So she puts on a welder's mask, which completely obscures her expression and thus takes away the possibility of subconscious cueing. Ferrogy, comes her muffled voice from behind the acromegalic mask. Can you put the ball in the refrigerator? He loses no time crossing the room again, going to the mini fridge at the edge of the room's L-shaped against-the-wall kitchen. He puts the ball in the refrigerator and closes the door. She stops talking then, levels the mask to look right at the camera, and says nothing. Sure he can do it, welder's mask or no. Now he does come right back, sit down and wait for her next move. It's like he wants to help her make this point. I turned the tape off after this scene, vowing to watch it later. It suddenly seemed much more interesting to just watch Ferrogy, today's older Ferrogy, 26, wander around in the next room. I didn't know a thing about Ferrogy until I came to work for the lab, but he's famous among school children who are interested in apes in countries like Japan. I never really got to the bottom of it during the entire time I worked there, but the Japanese are fascinated with apes. They love Ferrogy, who they watched grow up on documentaries made by NHK television, one every few years released there during the time he was growing up. They recognize him much more so than Americans do as the first ape in the world to understand spoken English. I couldn't get a good view of the ape room just by looking through the window, so I dragged my chair over to the window and I stood on it. Then I could see him lying just under it on the other side. He didn't seem to see me. He was lying on his back, looking at his nails, just like he'd done on the tape. Quickly and quietly he got up and he walked on all fours across the room, through a 3-foot metal door, and he climbed up a chain-link wall to a high loft in the ceiling. He moved like dancing, rocking and fluid, comfortable in his skin, just the slightest bit bored. How funny that the narrator on the tape kept comparing Farage's abilities to those of a 2.5-year-old human child when he was bigger than most men. His round, muscular shoulders were as wide as 2 high school football players standing side by side. The overhead lights caught his thick black hair and it made it shine. He had a male pattern baldness thing going on now that wasn't there when the tape was made. Once up in the loft, he sat heavily on his haunches and very slowly, unblinkingly, swung his head around and stared at me. It made me suck in my breath. He had seen me after all. He'd just headed up to the loft so he'd have a better vantage point to look back. That really is it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So thank you for your patience and for going with me through that whole, basically most of a chapter. I would love, I could talk about this book. Well, I don't need those anymore anyway. I could talk about this book all night, but I know we have all got places to go. I would really love any questions. Anne-Marie.
I've read the book and I loved it. And one of the things that intrigued me was how you developed really distinct personalities for each of the apes. So can you talk about that?
Sure. Anne-Marie asked about how I developed personalities for each of the apes. And I can't take credit for any of that. It was a real surprise to me when I went to work at this place that the apes have their own personalities. They have their own, I mean, they are sort of TV personalities in Japan. So Kanzi is, they talked about him as though he were a human man, right? And he's very laid back and, like I said 17 times, really big, really likes burritos, constant weight problem. And what they, how he was known around the lab as he's really frustrated. I mean, why is he really frustrated? He doesn't have a girlfriend. Because he lives with his mother, Malika, and his sister, and I'm sorry, wait, I got mixed up there. So Farage is based on the character of Kanzi. He was a very real ape. If you Google Kanzi, there's all kinds of great videos, and he's just this big, guy, and he's got a real weight problem now. There's a lot of people who are really concerned about him, and I think his weight was one of the reasons why Sue Savage-Rumbaugh came under fire this past fall, because she wasn't managing that. Some people feel like she wasn't managing that well. But yeah, he didn't have a girlfriend. And Pambanisha, his sister, did have a boyfriend. There was this circus ape named Pisuke. And he sort of lived, he didn't live with Pambanisha, he lived in another building, but they spent lots of time together. And Pambanisha had 3 babies between 2000 and 2006 by Pisuke. So I don't know if I'm getting this across or not, but these apes came with their personalities. All I did was change the names. The character of Pambanisha's character in this book, I just sort of took it lock, stock, and barrel. Pambanisha is a diva, or she was a diva. She passed away this fall. Way, way, way young. She wasn't 25. These bonobos are super susceptible to respiratory illnesses of all kinds, especially TB, but really, pneumonia sort of crept up on them, and they didn't know that's what she had, and all of a sudden she was gone. But she was famous for just being just this diva ape, and they would come to film her, and she would not be filmed. I swear to God, she wouldn't get up and go into the next room so that they could film her until you brought her presents. And she wanted blueberries. And when she's pregnant, she's a complete basket case and really hard to deal with. There's a scene in here that is straight out of exactly what happened one day at the lab. When I'm out in the woods with this photographer for the London Times. And this is a scene that, I mean, most of this really happened. And the photographer from the London Times, in real life, his name was Stuart. And he wants to film, Kanzi and Pamanitia, and he wants to get inside the cage with them because he's not getting any good pictures through the chain link fence. And he starts to, grouse about this. And I'm like, well, we can't, there's no way. We can't let you in there, into the enclosure. So he talks us into to letting him follow behind when the Christine character basically takes Pamanitia out on a leash, and she says, well, we're going to walk through the woods. We're going to go from building A to building B, and you can follow about 30 to 50 feet behind. But if you see her, if she throws you a look, if you start to feel scared, that is by her design. So you get out of there. And that's exactly what happened. She decided she did not want to film, and she laid down on the ground. She's pregnant as all get out. She won't do anything until you get her blueberries. And she just lays down on the ground. And so Stuart comes up, gets a little closer than is really safe, and I'm his minder, so I have to go too. And I'm like, Stuart, don't. So we go up there, and she's laying on the ground. And Stuart says, I just, can I take her picture? I'm like, no, you can't take her picture. And he's like, oh, come on, can I take her picture? And she whips her head around, and she stares at him, and she growls. And he, took off running. Because she was going to kill him. She wouldn't think anything of it. She's pregnant, nobody's gotten her any blueberries, and somebody's going to die. So that's a super long-winded answer to your question. I didn't do any of that. These apes all came fully formed to me. Angie. Angie's question is about how I formulated the ape and human familial and marital relationships, and same answer, really, because that was what the real experience. That was the message, sort of the real experience that made it make sense to me. I was taking notes, and everybody was taking notes, and we would get together over lunch, and wasn't that crazy? That wasn't crazy. But I didn't have anything that I thought of as a story until my friend Holly, so I'm in Atlanta, I moved to North Carolina, and my friend Holly, who also worked with the apes and worked super closely with Sue, she moved up to where I was, and we were hanging out. And she told me this one event that made sense to me. She said that one of the apes had gotten out, and it was really scary few minutes because most of the people, they didn't know where she was, and they eventually went and they got her and they let her back in, and everything was fine. But Holly said, that's when I had to leave. I'm like, well, why? What was it about that escape that made you leave? And she said, because they don't understand what was happening. So the ape got out, and that's in here too. I stole that scene as well. The ape got out because she's the mom ape, right? And the lead researcher was angry with the mom ape for whatever reason. So she said, all right, you don't treat me like that. I'm taking the babies away. She took the babies and she moved them over to another building. Wouldn't let the mom see them for 2 days. So the mom ape just is really, really, really upset. And that night she just leaves. She's just had enough. And she walks out. And Holly said they didn't understand that that's why she left. Sue and the other researchers refused to admit that it's because you're playing with that parental bond, and you're exploiting that, the feeling that mother ape has for her children, and that's why that ape left, not just because she's an ape and they get out whenever they can, right? So and it was that story that made me go, I have a novel now. So again, I stole it from real life. Yeah. The question is, what was this? And stop me if I get it wrong. Tell me about this this lab. What was the purpose of the research? So this guy that I work for, he's a prince of a guy. His name is Dwayne Rumbaugh, and he sort of came up at the San Diego Zoo, which trains most of the best primatologists in this country. And so he lands his first job out of his PhD at Emory, which is right down the road from Georgia State in Atlanta. And he gets there in the mid-70s. And he is very familiar with biomedical research on great apes, which they were doing at Emory. He's familiar with it, but he starts to feel like he doesn't want to do it. When he gets to Emory, at that point, they are still doing biomedical research on great apes that involves, mostly chimpanzees, that involves keeping them in these white cubicles where they never see the sun and they hardly ever get to go outside. And they were testing HIV vaccines on them at that point. So he gets to Emory, he's there for a little while and is very, very, very unhappy and starts to really develop the core of his own research, which is to back the Great Ape Project, which is an agreement among primatologists that they will not do any biomedical experiments on apes. So he leaves Emory and he goes to Georgia State, and they give him, he says, I want a lab, but I'm not going to do any biomedical. I'm going to do only cognitive research. None of these apes are ever going to be harmed. They're going to be outside a huge amount of the time. They're going to have humane enclosures, and they will never be shot up with anything except for if they're sick and the vet has to give them a shot. So that's how this lab starts, and it's founded on humane cognitive research with apes. He, in short order, meets and marries Sue Savage, who's a young researcher out of Oklahoma, and she is, about as far from biomedical research as you can possibly be. She wants to study ape culture and language. And so the lab that I worked at grew up around the two of them and their work, which was always about language. Jessica. So the question is, how did I use fiction to capture the crazy, and was I concerned about being sued? And yeah, very much.
Yeah,
well,
right. And what fiction allowed you to do in order to better capture the crazy that nonfiction would not have allowed you to do?
Yeah, I thought, I walked around with the nonfiction book idea in my head for 4 or 5 years, and I couldn't figure out how to do it. And even to the point where I knew what the story was, and I went back down to Atlanta, and I had beers with all my scientist friends, and we came to, we had a list of things that I was going to write about, and they were going to help me, and I was going to do it nonfiction. And I didn't really think about creative nonfiction because, the names were really important, right? So we spent an hour drinking beer saying, oh yeah, you got to do this, and you got to do that, and you got to do this. Because there, the field of ape language research, or any research with these great apes, is fascinating in itself. I mean, that's a couple books, and I feel like, and I would love to, in the future, write a nonfiction book about ape language research in universities, because it's really fascinating. I mean, they can't really do it anymore because the apes tend to bite people's fingers off. That's like the largest problem. So you can't get any universities super into it anymore because they can't afford enough insurance. That's the reason why the lab that I worked for moved out to Iowa, and was divorced from a university because that was a big problem. So we talked for an hour, and then at the end they go, okay, well, you're not doing any of this until Dwayne and Sue are dead, right? And I was like, I kind of was, yeah, I'd like to. And these are scientists. These are people who don't, I love them, they don't read fiction. And they don't read like nonfiction. They don't read outside of scientific journals. And so I got in the habit of thinking, okay, if I write a nonfiction book, it's got to try to be a science book. That involves a whole lot of problems because I'm not a scientist. And I can't imagine coming up with something that psychologists would accept, even if it didn't have all this like salacious material in it about apes biting people's fingers off and people being crazy. So from that conversation to the point where I realized, there's just no way to really do this nonfiction right now. It was a period of a few years, and I finally realized that nonfiction would allow me to really capture what it felt like to be in that environment and what those, the ape community interacting with the human community, I could do that really well in fiction. I could also point up there's some slapstick involved in like carrying a 400-pound ape up the stairs to an MRI machine, and you got to do it after midnight because you can't let any human patients in the hospital see this ape coming in for an MRI. I mean, that's happens. So there ends up being a whole lot of logistical problems with ape research, really of any kind, but if you're not kitted out like Emory was with all these like hospital facilities, we just had this lab. It was a little tiny building on a 55-acre campus. So anytime we had took the apes for brain scans to see what was going on in their brains, just take a picture. We'd have to load them up in the van, and it had to be really dark, and you have to sneak them up there and hope nobody saw. So fiction was also a great way to capture that. And I thought, well, I can really play up the slapstick of this and capture all the logistical problems, which really make up the majority of an ape scientist's day. And I, can write a nonfiction book about apes too, but and about ape research, but it's a very, very different book than the one I wanted to write. It's a very different story. So having said all that, when this book first was getting ready to come out, I'm in Tallahassee at that point, and I start planning this party in Atlanta. I'm going to go back to Atlanta with my book, and I'm going to, I'll have a party. I'll have everybody from the lab, or everybody from the lab who's not, insane and who's still my friend. And one of my scientist friends, Mike, he had heard about the book coming out, and he was one of the first people to buy it. And I wrote him, I got him on Facebook as soon as I saw he got it, and I'm like, okay, Mike, now this is a novel, and it's a story, it's a fiction story, and it's going to look a lot like your life, but it's a fiction story, and it's a fiction story about women who fall in love, and you will kind of recognize some of these characters a little bit. The character of Christine is actually very much based on his wife Mary. So he reads the book, he is freaked out. He is totally freaked out. And it's a guy, it's a really well-read guy, he's a really smart guy, but he doesn't read fiction. And he doesn't understand why the hell I would have written what I wrote. And so I was like, okay, cancel the party. We will be going to Atlanta, that's all right.
Was he offended by it?
He didn't say. I'm sure he was. So he was also very, very close to Dwayne Rumbaugh, who ran the lab until his retirement, and he's sort of second in command at this lab still. And so his new boss, who runs the lab now, is a guy named David. His name is escaping me right now because I need it. And he said, well, it's fine. It's okay. It's a little weird. I don't know what you're in the, woods with the woman for, or I don't know what's going on with that. And, he's like, I don't mind it, but I don't want to show it to David, and I don't want to show it to Dwayne. And I was like, okay, never mind. It's cool. And, and I just stopped everything in Atlanta. All of the marketing I was going to do in Atlanta, which was 5 hours down the road. I was going to put the books in my car and go down there and have a couple parties. No. So that's how I've handled the whole idea, of that. Larry. So the question is, if I may encapsulate Larry's awesome question, is that did knowing that I was going to self-publish, did that affect how I set up specific scenes because I was trying to stay to a specific word count? And actually, I didn't really make the decision to self-publish until the novel was done. So, and it was largely a timing issue. I really did not feel like I had a year to wait for the publication process, let alone find an agent, let alone let that agent find a publishing house. So I really made the self-publishing decisions, separate and after. And really I had the opposite problem. I had great readers. Steve was one of my first readers, and then 2 novelist friends in Florida went through this thing like crazy twice and served as developmental editors. And really the only, and across the board, the comments were, we need more, not less. So there was never any time that I can remember where I had to take something out. It was always, I had characters in there that were, the characters that I made up were a little thin, at least at first. And I got some great help from my friend Diane Roberts and Pam Ball, both novelists, and Steve is a fantastic reader as well. And they all said the same thing, we need more. There was the apes themselves, even though they sort of came to me fully formed, I went through a couple of drafts before they started to feel really fleshed out. And I went through 3 drafts before the character of the husband, before you could really see him. For some reason, I just didn't deal with him at all, because I wanted the main character, I wanted Deb's attention to be away from him. So what I had was, there wasn't anything there for her to turn away from. I had to go back and build him up. So I had to keep doing more, not less. Does that kind of answer the question? And I still only got to 200 pages. And Erica, so let me make sure I understand your question. Do I feel now that the book is out and what has happened to Sue this past fall, and sounds like she's doing pretty well now, by the way. Do I know, so does what happened to her in real life change how I view her, the character that I based loosely on her?
Right.
Yeah?
I should preface that by saying that I read the book right around the same time I read an article that you had posted about, Susie.
About, yeah.
So, it almost seemed to me as if the character of Soraya was almost continued and taken a step further by the reality.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering if
I'm dropping everything on the floor. Yes.
Yeah,
so
if you could speak to that a little bit.
yeah, I think I know where you're going. And, from the beginning, the character of Soraya was really based on an amalgamation of women primatologists. This is my first book, nonfiction book idea that I wrote up and sent to University of Georgia Press, because what I found, if you look back at like Diane Fossey, to a certain extent Jane Goodall, Penny Patterson, who works with Coco. You all heard of Coco out in California. Well, did you hear in about 2005, Coco, Penny was working with these women caretakers for Coco, right? And Penny's, you know, I don't know what's going on with Penny, but at one point they quit because, these women quit, like 3 of them, because they said, Penny Patterson is making us show our breast to Coco because she says Coco likes it. And they quit, right? So that's Penny Patterson. Then you got Sally Boyson. She was at Ohio State, and I think she is still there physically. She's a primatologist at Ohio State, and she had a colony of chimpanzees, and she lost her funding in the exact same way that happens in this book, and she just sort of let it go till the last minute, and a truck came from Texas, and they backed the truck up to the lab gates, and they said, we're putting your apes on this truck. And she chained herself to the gates, and she chained the gate closed, and she had a whole bunch of postdocs, also women. It's always women for some reason with these apes. There's a couple of men, here and there, but it's mostly women. They chained themselves to the lab's gates and were able to forestall them taking the apes away for a couple of hours. But that was it. So that's the long-winded way of saying what I started seeing happening is that most of the women ape researchers that we know about have at least some kind of taint of crazy attached to them for whatever reason. I mean, people did not think too much of Diane Fossey. It was always like, oh, she's that crazy ape lady researcher. And it was more of a type than, it was shocking really to realize how much of a type it was. There's this guy, Franz de Waal, who has written a number of books on bonobos. Hi, thanks for coming. He's written a whole bunch of books on bonobos. He's at Emory, and he's written some great books for the layman about the kinds of things, about ape society and what that says about human society. Nobody ever calls him crazy. He's probably not. But most of the women are just known colloquially as nuts. So I wanted to show that as early as when I was starting the novel. And now I just sort of sit back and go, yeah, that's what I was trying to show. That's what it is. And that's another nonfiction book project that I think would be fascinating. I just couldn't find a way to do that project without just doing a hatchet job on these women. Because if unless you moved in with one of them and were really able to do a really thoughtful portrait of how they made their decisions, if you just go by what's in the news, that stuff's crazy. Does that kind of get to what you're saying? Okay, wait. So Emery had one, and then Steve.
Could you talk a little bit about, you mentioned it in your talk earlier in the talk, and it plays a part in the novel, the fact that these apes are pop culture stars in Japan. I find that fascinating.
Yeah, that's really true. Talk about the fact that they're, bye, thanks for coming. Talk about the fact that the apes are pop culture stars in Japan. Yeah, that surprised me too. I don't know why. It just that was one of those things that was sort of given to me fully formed. You know what I mean? And they did come over from Japan and filmed a children's television show that was broadcast in real time to elementary school in Osaka. And Kanzi, the lead ape, participated in that. And it was really loud and freaky. It was very much like in the scene that I wrote. And it turned out that, for most ape the story of ape research in universities is a story of constantly dwindling funds since the 1970s. And the only reason that the lab that I worked for was able to sustain itself into the year 2000 was because NHK television in Japan was sending Sue Savage Rumbaugh about $25,000 a year just for access to the apes. And they would come over for about 2 weeks once a year, and they would film everything the apes did, and then they would, and they would party a lot and hang out with Sue, and then they would pack up and they would go back and they'd come back the next year. And every year they had a new special on Kanzi. And so it not only did Japan's love of apes, not only was it a surprise to me, it really kept her going, kept the entire lab going for 20 years. There was this guy, Bill, who was an ape researcher, and he spent the entire day with Kanzi and just looked right in his eyes and said, that was wrong, you shouldn't have done that, you bit Carolyn, and why did you do that? And, he reported that Kanzi seemed like he felt really bad. But, all we have is Bill's report, and all we have is what Kanzi did, and most of the time when one of these researchers at the lab I was at, when they were bitten, most of the time they returned to working with apes, often very soon after they got healed, and did not blame the apes at all.
Blame themselves?
They just kind of, this is, if you fight fires for a living, you accept that you might get burned. These people all knew that this was a real risk of this job, and they still do. It's not like this only happened at this, bitings only happen at this one lab. It's just something that they do. There was a story in the news about 2 years ago. This woman she was here in the Northeast, and she kept a chimpanzee for some reason, and the chimpanzee attacked her friend and nearly killed her. And it's like, why did that woman have an ape living in her house? She knew that could happen. This is something that happens with, this is something that apes do. They attack like this. That great movie about Nim Chimpsky, which you should all see because it is rocking. It talks about how Nim Chimpsky went from being a little cute baby ape to just being completely out of control. He had a real human connection with the people who took care of him, but he still attacked him. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it's not like humans ever do that to each other.
Oh no, we're so nice to each other. Yeah. Is there anything else? I thank you all for coming and staying. This is so great.